They came from Chicago in tight formation, 23 men carrying borrowed confidence, expecting Harlem to fold, until Bumpy Johnson stood still, listened quietly, and let the street decide who would leave breathing. The message didn't arrive with a letterhead. It didn't need one. It came folded inside numbers, 23 of them, moving east with purpose, carrying Chicago accents and borrowed certainty. Men who had been told a name was enough. Men who believed reputation could travel faster than consequence. Bumpy Johnson heard about them before they crossed the river, not because someone warned him in panic, because Harlem always spoke to him first. A shoe-shine man paused half a second longer than usual. A runner took a longer route home. A bartender stopped wiping the same glass and looked up. Information didn't rush in Harlem. It settled. Bumpy stood near a window that overlooked the street, hands relaxed, shoulders loose. The city moved below him the way it always did. Vendors calling, shoes scraping pavement, radios humming through open windows. Nothing changed, and that told him everything. Chicago wasn't sending negotiators. It was sending weight. Al Capone didn't need to introduce himself. His reputation arrived years earlier, wrapped in headlines and blood. What he wanted now was simpler: expansion, silence, compliance. Harlem was supposed to nod and step aside. Bumpy exhaled slowly. He didn't call a meeting, didn't summon soldiers, didn't issue orders that could be overheard. He walked down the block, past faces that didn't stare, past men who straightened without being told, past women who watched him pass with quiet certainty, like weather that had already decided its direction. This wasn't fear, this was familiarity. Bumpy stopped at a small storefront where an elder sat behind the counter, counting change with deliberate care. They exchanged a glance, nothing more. No words, none were needed. 23 men meant someone was testing him, not his temper, his control. Bumpy understood the difference. Violence was easy. Loud men relied on it because it announced itself. Real power didn't knock. It waited to be acknowledged. Chicago thought Harlem was a territory. Bumpy knew it was a community. That was the mistake. Back in his office, he finally sat. The chair creaked once, then held. He folded his hands, eyes calm, expression unreadable. Somewhere, not far away, 23 men were unpacking confidence they didn't earn. They believed the night would belong to them. Bumpy didn't correct the assumption. He let it breathe. Because when men come looking for dominance, they expect resistance. They expect noise. They expect fear to rise and reveal itself. What they never expect is patience. And patience in Harlem was lethal. Bumpy Johnson remained still as the city moved around him, already shaping an answer that wouldn't need explaining. Not yet. Morning came without announcement. Sunlight slid across brick and glass, settling into Harlem like it always had, unimpressed, observant. The streets filled gradually. Shop gates lifted. Radios clicked on. The neighborhood woke up the same way it always did. That was the point. Bumpy Johnson moved through it without escort. No visible protection. No hurry. His pace stayed even, measured to the rhythm of the block, not the tension underneath it. People noticed, not because he demanded attention, but because his presence answered questions before they were asked. A butcher nodded once, subtle. A woman sweeping her stoop paused, then resumed. A group of young men quieted as he passed, not out of fear, but alignment. This was not a neighborhood waiting to be told what to do. This was a neighborhood that already knew. Bumpy stopped at a corner where conversations usually lingered longer than they should. He didn't interrupt. He listened, not to words, but to tone. To what wasn't being said. Chicago's men had been seen, too clean, too loud, asking questions that didn't belong to them. That alone was an insult. Outsiders could walk Harlem, spend money, eat food, make deals if they respect the rhythm. But these men were measuring, counting, claiming space with their eyes. They were acting like owners. Bumpy turned down another street, hands loose at his sides, coat unbuttoned. He looked like any other man talking in the morning. But Harlem felt the difference, because leadership here wasn't enforced. It was recognized. Bumpy didn't speak to everyone. He didn't have to. Power, when real, doesn't repeat itself. It moves once and echoes. A quiet word passed from one doorway to the next. A look traveled faster than footsteps. Information moved without sound. No orders were given. No panic spread. Harlem didn't need instructions. It needed confirmation. And Bumpy gave it simply by being seen. Chicago believed influence arrived with numbers, with threats delivered by unfamiliar faces. They thought presence was volume. They were wrong. Presence was memory. It was history, shared across blocks and kitchens and late nights. It was knowing who paid rent on time, who needed help, who deserved protection. By the time Bumpy returned to his office, Harlem had already adjusted its posture. Windows watched, corners listened, doors stayed open just long enough to observe. The 23 men didn't feel hunted, not yet. They felt something worse, unwelcome. Bumpy sat again, the same chair, the same stillness. He reached for nothing, called no one. His authority didn't need to announce itself. It was already moving through the city like a held breath. Chicago had sent men to make a point. Harlem had already answered, quietly. They didn't arrive together. That was the first mistake. Chicago's men understood force, not atmosphere. They spread out across Harlem in pairs and trios. Thinking visibility meant control. Thinking movement meant dominance. They wore confidence like borrowed coats, well fitted but not theirs. They asked questions, not directly, never politely. They leaned too close at bars, lingered too long outside numbers houses. Let their accents hang in the air like challenges. Harlem noticed everything. A man sweeping the sidewalk didn't look up, but he listened. A kid delivering groceries took a longer route, twice. A bartender poured drinks without meeting eyes. None of it felt dramatic. That was what made it dangerous. The men from Chicago expected resistance, a shove, a threat, a raised voice to justify what they'd been sent to do. Instead, they found space closing without sound. Conversations stopped when they entered rooms. Stools shifted away. Doors closed earlier than usual. They felt it by late afternoon, not fear, isolation. One of them laughed it off, loud and forced, telling the others Harlem was soft. Another reminded him that silence meant listening. A third checked his piece twice before nightfall. They weren't being followed. They were being measured. Bumpy Johnson never appeared. That unsettled them more than anything else. They had been told a name. I expected a man to confront them. Expected a moment they could point to and say, this is where it started. But Bumpy stayed absent by design. Power doesn't rush toward threats. It lets threats reveal themselves. As night settled, Harlem changed its posture. Music drifted lower. Footsteps spaced out. Lights stayed on just long enough to show who was inside. The 23 men regrouped in fragments, irritation sharpening into unease. They talked about making an example, about reminding the neighborhood who Chicago was. They didn't understand yet. Examples require witnesses, and Harlem wasn't offering any. Somewhere not far away, decisions were already made quietly, carefully, not fueled by anger, guided by balance, by the understanding that what came next would echo longer than gunfire. Bumpy Johnson didn't need to be present for that. His authority was already in the room, waiting. The insult wasn't loud. That's what made it dangerous. It happened in daylight, where everyone could see it and no one could pretend it didn't happen. One of Chicago's men, too comfortable, too certain, decided silence meant permission. He leaned where he shouldn't have leaned, spoke where he hadn't been invited to speak. He named Chicago out loud, not as a rumor, not as a warning, as ownership. The room changed, not dramatically, not all at once. A chair scraped back half an inch. A hand stopped mid-motion, eyes lowered, not in fear but restraint. Word traveled fast. By the time Bumpy Johnson heard, the story was already precise. No exaggeration, no confusion. Just the shape of the disrespect, carried carefully from mouth to mouth, public, deliberate, unnecessary. Bumpy didn't react immediately. He sat, hands folded, listening to the silence after the words were spoken. That silence mattered more than the insult itself, because it told him something important. Harlem had heard it, and Harlem was waiting. This wasn't about pride, it was about structure. If that kind of disrespect stood, it would invite more, louder, cruder, until restraint looked like weakness. And Bumpy Johnson did not rule by fear, but he did rule by clarity. He stood slowly. No anger in his face, no rush in his movement. He walked to the window and looked out over the street, watching people move as they always had, unaware that a line had just been crossed for them. That was the weight of leadership. Every response had to protect the many, not satisfy the one. Bumpy turned away from the glass. He didn't give a speech, didn't threaten retaliation. He spoke a few quiet words to the man nearest him. Words that didn't sound like orders. Words that didn't need repeating. The message moved. Chicago's men felt the shift before they understood it. The street no longer avoided them. It watched them, measured steps, count time. The air grew tighter, not louder. They had wanted a reaction. They were inevitable. The insult couldn't be ignored, not because it bruised an ego, but because it tested the foundation. And foundations, when challenged, are either reinforced or replaced. Bumpy Johnson sat back down. The response was already in motion. Night didn't explode, it folded. Harlem grew quieter in the way a room does when everyone knows the verdict before it's read. Streetlights hummed. Footsteps spaced themselves out. Doors closed, not in fear, but in understanding. The 23 men felt it closing in. Not pursuit, precision. They regrouped where they could, voices low now, confidence thinning at the edges. Plans were revised. Jokes stopped landing. Someone suggested leaving early, just to reset. Another reminded him they hadn't delivered the message yet. That was the problem. They were still thinking in terms of tasks. Bumpy Johnson thought in terms of outcomes. What happened next wasn't chaos. There were no sirens screaming through the night. No scattered gunfire tearing the dark apart. Harlem didn't need spectacle. It needed resolution. Men stepped into place without being summoned. Not soldiers, neighbors. People who understood the streets not as territory but as responsibility. Movements were timed. Paths were closed gently, like doors guided shut rather than slammed. Chicago's men realized too late that they were no longer moving through Harlem. Harlem was moving around them. Some tried to push back, some tried to bargain. Most simply froze when they understood resistance had already been calculated and dismissed. By dawn, the city exhaled. 22 of the men were gone from Harlem's streets. Not displayed, not discussed. Absence was enough. Absence was the message. One man was allowed to leave. He didn't run. He didn't boast. He walked carefully, carrying something heavier than fear. He carried instruction. When he reached Chicago, he didn't exaggerate, didn't dramatize. He said exactly what he'd been told to say, the way it had been given to him, plain, controlled, final. Harlem isn't open. Harlem isn't impressed. And Bumpy Johnson doesn't negotiate with noise. The message landed because it wasn't shouted. It was proven. 600 and 800 words. The message didn't echo with gunfire. It arrived quietly. Chicago heard it the way seasoned men hear the truth, without ceremony, without witnesses, without room for debate. One man returned, one voice, one sentence delivered without trembling, without drama, without pride. That was enough. Because power doesn't repeat itself. It doesn't argue. It establishes conditions. Back in Harlem, the morning unfolded the same way it always did. Milk crates stacked outside bodegas. Radios hummed low. Children moved between stoops and sidewalks like the streets belonged to them. They did. Nothing was announced. Nothing needed to be explained. Absence spoke louder than headlines ever could. 23 men had arrived with purpose. 22 did not remain. And Harlem stood exactly where it had been. Bumpy Johnson didn't celebrate. He didn't gather people to remind them who had won. Victories built on noise decay quickly. He understood that restraint is what makes authority last. He walked the neighborhood again. Same pace, same posture. People didn't crowd him. They didn't thank him. They didn't ask questions. That wasn't the relationship. This wasn't protection in exchange for loyalty. It was stewardship, balance, a shared understanding that someone was paying attention so others didn't have to live on edge. A shopkeeper met his eyes and nodded once. A woman paused, her sweeping just long enough to watch him pass. A group of young men straightened without realizing they'd done it. That was the sound of power. Not obedience, recognition. Chicago recalculated. They didn't send another wave, didn't test again. Men like Capone understood one thing clearly. When a response is measured instead of emotional, it means someone is thinking further down the road than you are. Harlem wasn't closed to the world. It was close to disrespect, and that distinction mattered. Bumpy returned to his office and sat alone. No visitors, no victory lap. Just a man at a desk, hands folded, eyes calm. The city outside continued breathing, unaware of how close it had come to being forced into someone else's design. That was the legacy part. Not dominance for its own sake, but prevention. He had protected the structure, the invisible agreements that allowed people to wake up, work, argue, laugh, and sleep without feeling hunted. That was power used properly, quietly, decisively, once. Violence had been possible. That was enough. Because when violence is certain but withheld until necessary, it carries weight long after the moment passes. Chicago would remember that. So would everyone else watching from a distance, wondering whether reputation alone could bend Harlem. It couldn't. Not because Bumpy Johnson was the loudest man in the room, but because he was the calmest. Because he understood that respect doesn't come from threats. It comes from consistency, from lines drawn clearly and enforced without hesitation. Years later, men would talk about that night without embellishment. No myths, no heroics, Just the facts spoken carefully, like they still mattered. 23 went in. One came back, and Harlem stayed in Harlem. That was the message. Not delivered with bravado, not carved into headlines, but written into memory. And memory, when shared by a community, lasts longer than fear ever does.